also this time around, and therefore I'll take my time and just share some of move into a completely different direction, because you know there was something very special yesterday night. Usually in a party, when in particular when you celebrate 65th birthday of somebody, you start telling, well, I met Yoram in 1960 for the first time. At that time I was doing so-and-so, and then I moved and did so-and-so. And by the end of the day, you never mention Yoram, but you talk about your history. Yesterday, everyone was talking about Yoram, so I'll take the opportunity and talk about myself. So, it's really, the nice thing about being around here is because at the last row is sitting David Pines, who was the TA when I started Introduction to Economics in the Hebrew University. And he remembers, as well as many of the people around here, coming in the first class, and the teacher announced his name, gave the home assignment, and we never covered the material, but we had to solve the home assignment. Then years later, 2-3 years later, I was already proctoring, and I had Eitan's home assignment in front of me, green and blue colors, 3 colors every home assignment. I knew immediately this guy is going to make it. And the following year, it was a team of Gur and Yoram. I knew they are going to make it. Years later, I came to Gary Becker's class. And Gary was really crazy. He had a list of students, and he called them by names. He gave them relatively easy questions, but they were really frozen out of fear. But the questions were really easy. But it was going like this throughout the year. One of them was Bob Michael, who later taught Eddie. And then, just to finish the story, years later I was attending a parents' meeting. It was one of the leading, or perhaps the leading secondary school in Jerusalem. And all the parents were cursing the teacher. You are teaching this, it was about Bible classes, telling the teacher, you are teaching the students chapters which are not in the exam. And she was excusing herself, I'm trying to teach them how to understand the Bible, to learn the Bible. This was of no interest to them. You teach the chapters. So, what do I have to say about the paper? About the paper, I think that the analogy with the speeding is slightly wrong. Because in speeding, we have what we are trying to do, what the police tries to do, is on one hand, to maximize its income from fines, and then the secondary purpose, reduce speeding and perhaps reduce road accidents. But what Eddie tells us is that he regards a test, he says, think of a test score as an observable signal to employees or to future schools which the students may attend. And here we really have to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of the exam? Are we trying to encourage our students to study? Are we trying to test what's the productivity of the teaching process, namely the team, students versus teacher? Or do we try to learn about the knowledge, the specific human capital which the student has acquired, namely some basic capital, knowledge capital, which we taught, or do we try to check whether our students knows to think or isn't able to think independently? And I think that for different, depending on the purpose of the exam, we should have also a different type of an exam. Because if we want to learn, to teach our students to think, maybe that the purpose of the home assignment, which was given ahead of the class, was the right way. And it was a tough way. It wasn't graded, by the way. He had to bring in 75% of the home assignments, but they were never graded. Should we give easy exams or should we give tough exams? So I think that if we want just to test whether the teachers are doing their job, irrespective of who is the student who succeeds or not, then the analysis is right. But if we want in a heterogeneous class to know, to give a signal who is a better one and who is worse, then we really have to think about the problem slightly different. Then there are implications for what type of class should be organized. Because essentially when Eddie speaks about in his papers, is a homogeneous class, either losers or winners, either low productivity or high productivity. But if you have a heterogeneous class, maybe that the theory would not apply. Then there is another question which we face all the time. Namely, there is another dimension. There's a problem which Eddie mentioned at the end of noise versus signal. But should we have a difficult test and grade it easily, or should we have an easy test and then be very severe in our grading process? Then we should take into account also the cost of tests, because sometimes of course it's the time of the teacher, which Eddie mentioned, time of preparing the test and correcting the test, the times of the students, but very often like in the Israeli experience, in the 12th grade, students don't learn anything. They just learn how to prepare for the test. So this is a wasted time. Then, of course, Eddie already mentioned it, that essentially we have a repetitive game where essentially we test the same students time and time again, and therefore we can diversify our strategy and, as he mentioned, move from easy tests like Gary to the tough tests, which are the ones which awaited the students in Gary's class at the end of the year. So these are my comments, and now I'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I was going to come back. Yeah, okay. I was going to kind of go to right at the end of your talk. You talked about this optimal difficulty problem in the future research. Well, there's actually this item. Are you familiar with the item response theory in psychometrics? Is basically sort of been solving this problem. It's called adaptive testing. So kind of the most informative answer or the most informative question that I could give any given individual is a question that that individual would have a 50-50 chance of getting correct. And So sort of theory is built on this notion that they're think of the or at least one particular version of the theory, a simple version of the theory would be that an individual has an ability and the test has a difficulty. And so when you sort of match the difficulty parameter to the ability parameter, you get this 50-50 thing. And so, for example, the first question that you might say you had a heterogeneous group, you would ask, the first question would be to the mean of that mean person in that group, and the guys that get it right, you should ask a more difficult question. The guys that get it wrong, you should ask a less difficult question, and so on. And in some sense, I was thinking as Reuben was talking, that in a way, sort of the progression through, kind of the progression through school in some ways is like that adaptive testing, and it kind of comes to another question that I had, which is sort of having to do with things like tracking. Yeah. So you have sort of first graders all come in, and they all sort of get into the same. They're all in the same class, and they're all learning these word lists. And sort of as time is going on, by the time you get to high school, typically there's been quite a bit of differentiation in sort of what's the curriculum that people are following and so forth. And to some extent, it sounds like that sort of thing. So I think in some sense, I think you could broaden the scope of what you're talking about to sort of thinking about sort of the role of testing in the kind of educational career development. There's a kind of a sorting that's going on and a set of incentives that are going on, and then I think this question that Reuben is raising is really key. Getting people to learn the material that will ultimately maximize their human capital.
The same human capital, and therefore will receive in the labor market or in other markets different prices. But by that, reduce the incentive of the low-able guy to take it. So it's not clear to me how you get that, and what is exactly the difference between that and having one exam in which some people can do in different levels of quality. Another point that I have, but maybe I will start later with you, it's that in some sense, it's implicitly in this model, there is only one type of ability that people have. So kind of a cognitive ability. But if you think about, let's say, a little bit richer in terms of two types of abilities, something which is more cognitive and other which is more kind of motivation, then the selection into these different groups, it's a bit more complicated, and we have examples from the US in which the easy to achieve cognitive titles have zero value in the labor market.
Once more, another issue that did not come up in modeling is peer effects within class. And at least coming back from Denmark, their attitude is to minimize distinctions between students, and that's a crime. So us fail just uniform attention.
Probably I repeat what Reuben said, but I think a good example is if I take literally the idea no child left behind. Basically, you want to check whether the students and the teacher, all of them went over a certain amount, and all of them, the pass rate is 100%, which is the opposite just to the qualitative exams that we do in PhD. Basically, you want to select all the people that you don't want and just keep the ones that you want. So I think the key issue, I'm not sure it's it's really what you want to get out of the exam.
By saying that not everyone gets informed, and once you drive on one of these roads, you know that there's a probability it's going to be enforced. Although if you listen to the radio at a certain hour, you know exactly what road, but not everyone managed to listen to it. So analogous to the education case, you search for an interior cube. But what happens if instead of searching for this interior cube, you announce what the support of the questions will be, and very close to the exam, you limit that support, but you limit it close enough to the exam such that there is some advantage to the high, to the low, the people that can learn fast, and there's some disadvantage to the people that can learn it more slowly, and that way you do just affect that whole way of process.
Okay.
More to add, it was really conceptual one. It seemed like all the questions really were saying there are multiple goals in the model. One's only focusing on one. I guess the two goals that you mentioned should be in the model brought together. One is the incentive question about how to get more learning on the one hand, and the other is the sorting question. Right. And those two goals are in basic conflict. And you have to, what is the strategy trade-off between those two goals?
That's partly what I wanted to say, but also the two examples you gave in this indicated cube, being 1 or 0, where was monotone distributions up on the tensor, go down, monotone up and down. Yeah. These are not very sort of example. Have you tried to characterize whether the result is one or the other, depending on the some characteristics of the density function of ability? That will be your raw material, and on these parameters, okay, and so forth. I mean, for example, if above a certain level of the tail, the density has certain parameters. I think it would be important for you as a tester to know the distribution. You want to know which method is optimal by the characteristics of the density.
Okay, good comments. Let me just do this very briefly. Most of the points related around this, as Dale pointed out, this distinction between diagnostics and incentives. And in fact, Bob's first question really went to that as well, because when the theory that you laid out was really one of diagnostics only. And if you think about incentives, the 50-50 rule is not right from an incentive point of view. The reason, it may be right, but it's not right, at least conceptually. Because what you care about from an incentive point of view is not the probability, but the change in the probability associated with effort. So it's not the level of the probability, it's the derivative, right? And so I think that's an important point. It really points out the distinction between, thinking this in terms of diagnosis and thinking of it in terms of the incentive story. The reason, I don't want to say that the diagnostics aren't important. They certainly are, but that's not what this debate is about. This debate is really about incentives. The whole issue of the No Child Left Behind and accountability is not really about figuring out, who's a good kid and who's a bad kid. It really is about the incentive. So that's why I focused on it. Now, I don't think that's not a sufficient excuse for ignoring the other side of the problem. That was why the emphasis. The tracking point, I agree, actually, is an important issue. And in fact, one of the things you can think about is if you track people, you also can design better tests for those people that you track. So the test that's right for one type is not the test that's right for the other type. This comes back to your issue of heterogeneity. I don't think of a homogeneous classroom. I do think of them as heterogeneous, but the heterogeneity is actually characterized by that density function. So it's kind of the unobserved heterogeneity, and that's when you went to the diagnostics aspect. And I think that's what you were up to there. Let's see. In terms of the market prices, I thought about that somewhat, and I discussed a little bit in the paper. If this were a problem that had no externalities, and if it's just a student problem, then you would expect that the market would set that price K. Think of K as the penalty. You could think that, it's an inference problem, but under certain conditions, the market might draw the appropriate inference about what the student knows by looking at the test score. The assumptions actually to make that work are not so trivial, but to a first approximation, that might be right. That's not going to work for the teacher problem, because for the teacher problem, the penalty that the teacher faces for not imparting knowledge on the student is unfortunately not going to be market determined. So that's why I was thinking of the K as being primarily exogenous, because that's, again, in the context of this policy debate, that's probably the way you have to think about it. But you're quite right, and I did worry about that a little bit. I don't think I nailed it in here, but it was something I was concerned about as well. It is an important point. The peer effects, Yoram, is an important point. It's one that I thought about actually in another paper. I don't know if you know this QJD paper on educational production. I have this disruption model. This is actually what got me back into this education stuff. And the essence of that model is that when I have kids in a classroom, if one kid misbehaves, then no one else learns. So because what happens is the teacher has to take her time and address that one kid's concerns. And so these peer effects are very strong in these kinds of models. And then what you get are lots of implications about tracking and segregation and asking who would pay. Everybody wants to be in the good kids class, but the question is who's willing to pay the most to be with the good kids. And so those kinds of problems.
I just think the policy in Denmark is actually the worry very much about creating inequality in the class. That's the prime.
The post-Canadian country. They want equality, so
I was
no
also
grade
surprised.
You pass or no pass, and then we never.
You mean in terms of the grading?
Grading.
Yeah.
It's very common.
Yeah, well, but the equality has, again, this is sort of this issue of tracking. That's been true in the U.S. for the past 30 years. That's been the fashion, and now people are starting to drift back toward tracking because it has, there are huge social costs associated with this equality issue, because you basically, you get right, exactly. So, but yeah, I take that point. Yeah, that's the debate, exactly. We had a point there was a point about Norway and France. It's what it sounded like you were about there was belief formulation, and what you could sort of convince these guys based on what you announced. And that might be sort of another extension of the direction in which to go. Dale, I think we covered, and Eitan. I tried. I tried a few different things, and I kept getting. It turned out I kept getting corner solutions. I have not been able to characterize kind of the more general problem. Sort of thinking about stuff, sort of standard stuff like first order stochastic dominance. I just haven't gotten anything so far, but I need to work harder on it. It's definitely the way to go on this thing, because I agree with you, it's important. Why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much. We'll convene after the
You're always funny. You're always funny.
I just want to make two announcements. One is important about the lunch. So those who don't know, we have when the session is over at about 1:30, we have lunch upstairs as yesterday, and everyone is invited. The other one is for the authors, and the authors we wish very much to have potentially a book out of this conference. That depends certainly on the number of papers that would be submitted. You could, it's possible that you have some other paper that you think would fit a book. The idea is to go with Elsevier. And one of the reasons is that also there is a potential that the European Economic Review, which I'm a co-editor, has a policy that if a book is published by the Elsevier, then we can choose, we can is also referee, but we can do the European Economic Review referee to have a special cluster. The special cluster would include something between 4 to 6 papers, and then we can devote it both mainly to the subject and the scientific community, but also for Yoram with a short. So I would be a co-editor maybe of that. Now I will send you all email soon after the conference, and then each of you on your flight back either write the paper like some people do here, or just think about it and send the paper when they get back. Okay, now it's the last session, and Andy Postlewaite will present his joint work with Dan Silverman and Larry Samuelson on consumption, commitments, and preferences. And I give you the 5 minutes.
Okay, good, thank you. Before I begin, I want to, first of all, thank the organizers for organizing this conference. It's been wonderful, at least for me, I think for others. Particularly want to thank Yoram for, in fact, having done enough in his lifetime to, in fact, give us an excuse to be here. So the title of the paper is up here. This is joint work with Larry Samuelson and Dan Silverman. Before I begin, let me say that there'll be a test at the end of this. There's one question, and it's, can you spell my name right? That's okay. So this works, or?
No, that's not all. You wanted
So
to work
I was going to use this? Yes? It worked a minute ago.
Yeah, because I thought. I don't know.
It's okay if you leave my name up longer, they have a better chance on the test. Okay. Before I begin, let me just make a couple of comments about the motivation for this work. The earliest time I started thinking about this project was a little over 10 years ago. It was in the early 90s that there was a recession in the United States, and there was something strange about the recession. The recession, you saw on TV on a regular basis, on the news, you saw how terrible this recession was, that there were these layoffs and these layoffs. And there was a large number of stories in the front page of the New York Times about the problems of the recession. But when you went back and looked at the actual data and you found the number of unemployed, it wasn't particularly exceptional. The recession wasn't one in which there was some abnormal number of people laid off, despite the fact that when you listened to the news, it sounded like it was the worst recession since the Great Depression. And what I wondered at the time was that when you saw that the layoffs, the stories you saw where it was people that were being laid off from Xerox, from Kodak, and from IBM, and what occurred to me was that perhaps the problem was not so much that, it wasn't so much that it was newsworthy because the number of people that were unemployed or laid off, but who they were. And that is that these were people that had thought that they weren't going to get laid off. These were not auto workers this time that were being laid off. That wasn't the stories you saw. But you saw the stories about the number of people from IBM, and that these were the first layoffs ever of these white-collar workers in IBM. And as we know, being unemployed is not such a big problem in general. I'm unemployed 3 months of the year, June, July, and August every year. But this is not a particular problem. The problem with unemployment is when you didn't foresee it and you didn't plan for it. So this paper is the outgrowth of trying to think about these problems. And get this right, okay. So the idea of this is going to be that there's consumption commitments. The problem perhaps with being unemployed is that if you didn't foresee it, you might have made some decisions that made it very costly to be unemployed. That is that it may be that if I'm an auto worker, then when I decide that I'm going to go out and figure out what my housing is, I'm not going to buy such a big house. If I work for IBM and think I'm not ever going to be laid off, I buy a bigger house, I take out a big mortgage. If I work for IBM, it may be that I think that, in fact, instead of just renting my ski vacation house, I'll buy a house in the ski location and I'll take out a mortgage for that. I may decide that I'll have more children if, in fact, I think that my job is very secure and I'm not likely to be laid off. So it may be that depending upon whether the people thought there was a very high probability of being laid off or not, they made different kinds of decisions. And the decisions like this are decisions that it's very difficult to, in fact, adjust your consumption downward. That is, in the United States, people adjust their housing. Those that own homes adjust their housing either up or down after about 11 years on average. People that own cars adjust their cars about every 5 years. Adjusting children is more difficult. Adjusting downward, well, at least adjusting downward is hard. Adjusting upward is not so hard. We all know how to do that. But the adjustments are fairly costly on some of these things. And how risk averse I'm going to be is going to, in some sense, depend on these kinds of decisions that I've made. To what extent have I made consumption decisions that are going to be costly to adjust? So, why do I make these committed consumptions? I make these consumption commitments because there's a value in it. If I buy a house, it's cheaper than renting a house. I get more value per dollar in the house that I buy than if I rent. We understand why. We understand this because of some of the moral hazard problems in leasing. And we understand that, in fact, if I own the house, then I can make adjustments to the house so that, in fact, it better fits my particular tastes. For a car, it's the same thing. It's cheaper to buy a car than to, in fact, rent the car from Hertz on a weekly basis. Children is even more difficult. There's not much of a market in rental children. Although there were times in the past that if you'd contacted me, I might have been able to make a deal for you. But these commitments that we make are going to exacerbate the cost of negative income shocks. When I've bought a house or when I bought a car, it's fairly costly, in fact, to adjust the consumption of those items downward or upward. That the transactions cost for a house are 6% just on the actual transaction itself, plus on top of that, all of the hassle of, in fact, putting everything that you own into a truck and moving it to somewhere else. Neglecting children, the costs of negative income shocks can be quite serious. So these incentives for inflexible consumption provide a reason for consumers to prefer less risky income to more risky income. It's something separate from whatever exogenous risk aversion you might have in fact had. So the commitments are going to induce some aversion to risk, even if you're risk neutral. The idea of this, and a main point that we want to get across on this, is that the risk preferences you have are not exogenous the way they are presented in many, many of the models that we look at, but rather they're going to be endogenous. They're going to depend upon the decisions that you make. So that ultimately I'm going to be talking about things like labor contracts, and what I'm going to argue is that the optimal labor contract is going to be intimately connected with this other market over here, the market for housing and what's the technology for making different kinds of housing decisions. So the consumption, now a major point of this is that consumption commitments are choices that can be coordinated with times of income insecurity or income security. Now, this is going to give you an economy of scale of risk bearing, and it's going to give you an incentive to bunch risk together. Roughly, you can think of the story as being the following. What I have is there's a certain amount of risk that I'm going to face. If there's some economy-wide shocks that are going to hit, somebody's going to have to bear those. There's going to be some risk in my lifetime that if I'm an average person, there's some risk that I'm going to bear a certain amount of shock. Let me tell you what my optimal plan is. My optimal plan is what I want you to do is I want you to lump as much of that risk as you can in when I'm 21 years old. And what I'm going to do is when I'm 21 years old, I'm not going to buy a house, I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to have kids. What I'm going to do is when you lay me off, I'm going to go home and live with my mom for a little while and watch TV till times get better. And then in return for that huge amount of risk that I bear when I'm 21, when I'm 29, I want you to give me very, very little risk. I want you to sit there and say, okay, now your income is relatively secure, we won't lay you off, now I'll get married, I'll have my kids, I'll go on out and buy a recreational vehicle and, with a big payment on this, I'll buy a house with a big mortgage, and I can do all of those things because my income will be secure at that time. So fundamentally in this model, what there's going to be is a non-convexity, and the non-convexity is going to be in this lumpiness of a lot of these decisions, having children or not having children, buying a house or not buying a house, and so on. Okay, we skipped. Okay. So let me just give you just a little bit of numbers here. These are not meant to be evidence of the kind of story I'm telling you, but what these are just some numbers that are at least consistent with the kind of story I want to tell you. This line here is just the average unemployment for the 1990s, from 1990 to 2000 in the US. And this is by age. And what we see is that the average unemployment during this period is much higher for the young people than it is for old, not surprising. The average home ownership, of course, is going up. That's not surprising as well. But we have this inverse relationship between the average unemployment and the home ownership. Now, there's lots of stories for this, I say, that I'm not arguing that this is in fact the reason, that the reason for this is the kind of story I've told you, but at least it's consistent with it. What I said before was that it's not really unemployment that's so much of a problem. If we foresee the unemployment and I can tell exactly when it's going to happen, that's not a big problem. This is the same story, except that what I have here is the volatility of the unemployment. If you just take the annual rates, take the variance of the annual rates, this is the variance by age. And what we see is that not only are the young more likely to be unemployed, but the variance is much higher of the unemployment rates for young people. This variance decreases over time within your lifetime. This relates this idea of your income volatility to the probability that you're going to own a house. So what this is from, this is just a probit of home ownership in 1993 on all the things that you'd think would matter: your age, your education, your average income, your current income, your past income volatility, marital status, children, and so on. And then what we do is just fix all of the variables at their average levels and just measure a standard deviation change in your mean income and relate that to the probability that you're going to own a home. And what we see is as your income goes up, the probability that you're going to own a home goes up. That's not surprising. As the volatility of your income goes up, the probability that you're going to own a home is going to go down. This is just the graphs where, as I say, the mean value for all the variables except for income volatility and the average income. The same picture, except this is the age at the birth of your first child. That the same kind of a regression, and what you're going to look at is now that as your average income goes up, the age at which you have the average age at which you have your first child is going up. As your volatility of your income goes up, the average age of the father at the time of the birth of the first child is going down. I'm sorry, I said those backwards. That's the average age of the father is going down with average income. That is, those with higher average income are more likely to have the children at a younger age. When it's more volatile, you're more likely to have your first child at an older age. Okay, so the employment contracts. An attractive plan is what I said a second ago. When I'm young, I'm going to make very few commitments, and I'm going to want to assume as much of my lifetime risk as I can. And then when I'm older, I want to enjoy the benefits of the committed consumption with a relatively stable income. So I'm going to want two things. I'm going to want not to be laid off, and I'm going to want not so much volatility in income conditional upon my being still employed. Now, the point of this is going to be that the layoffs and the wage rigidity can be optimal even if I'm risk neutral. I'm going to write down a model in which people are risk neutral, but they have the possibility of making some kinds of commitments. And even for a person that's risk neutral, the possibility of these commitments is going to induce risk aversion. It's going to come from the choices that they make. So the key point of this paper is that when there are advantages to this inflexible consumption, then the choices of risk neutral people may induce aversion to risk, and that the effects of that wage risk are going to differ from the risks of employment, of unemployment. Okay, so the basic model. There are going to be three goods. There's a non-commitment good, that one I can't make commitments on at all. And that's just normalized price to 1. There's going to be labor, and there's going to be a wage rate that's the price of labor. And then there's going to be a consumption good Z to which I can either make a commitment or not. The Z, this good, is something, think of it as housing if you want, and I can either rent housing on a spot market or I can buy housing. The consumer is going to live for n periods. The period T utility function is just a function of that's not what I wanted to do. The period T utility function just depends on how much in that period of the good that I can't commit to that I'm consuming and how much of the commitment good. And this is going to have strictly negative own second derivatives. It's homogeneous of degree 1. That is, that it's risk neutral. Now, the consumer is going to maximize just the sum of the, utilities over time. There's no discounting. The no discounting, let me say now, this exercise is middle-brow theory. Well, middle-brow at best, maybe low-brow theory. This is a reverse engineering exercise. I believe the story that I'm telling you, that there's a world out there in which consumption commitments are going to make a difference in people's risk attitudes. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a model to, in fact, give us that result. As we know, we've got enough free variables to work with in economics that we can always do that. What I'm going to do is every time I hit any kind of an obstacle toward going forward, I'm going to make an assumption to make it as easy as possible just to continue on. At every point where I'm making an assumption like no discounting, my strong belief is that that's not really going to affect qualitatively the answer that I get. That is, if I wrote down, if I added discounting to this, it's going to make the basic point that I want to make less transparent. It may be quantitatively less important, but it'll still be there. There's only going to be one of the assumptions that I'm going to make that really has some bite, that's driving this, and I'll point that out as we get there. Okay, the consumer can't borrow or save, same thing. That is, if you can save money, that's going to ameliorate the effects. I'd be willing, in fact, to a little bit more likely to take on a mortgage if I can save money as a buffer stock. But it's not going to ameliorate it's not going to eliminate the effect. That is that, in fact, I'm going to make different kinds of decisions because I have some insecurity in my income in the future. Okay. The consumer is going to be either in state 1, a good state of the world, or state 2, there's a bad state of the world, where the bad state of the world is going to be that the firm you work for is going to have to, has had a negative shock. And the probabilities that you don't have a shock are probability P. Probability 1 minus P is the probability that the firm does have a shock or that you're in the bad state. The income in state I is just WI unless you're unemployed. If you're unemployed, the income is 0. We assume that firms can't pay workers when they're unemployed. Again, if you allowed them to pay some, that wouldn't change. If you allowed the firm to perfectly insure the worker, that would change it. We're going to make an assumption that prevents or prohibits the firm from providing perfect insurance. So the consumer is going to be unemployed in period T with probability rho of T. That's not necessarily 1 minus P, because the firm could be in a bad state of the world, but what we're going to see is that the optimal contract is going to have that probability that somebody is unemployed concentrated. That is, most of the workers are going to be either probability 1 of being laid off in the bad state of the world or probability 0. We're going to want to concentrate the layoffs so that the people will know that even if in a bad state of the world, their income is going to be relatively secure. That's what an optimal contract is going to look like in general. So the consumer is going to make a state contingent plan. The amount of the non-committed good that he purchases or consumes in state 1, the amount of the potentially committed consumption in state 1, and X2 and Z2, the consumption in state 2 of those goods. Okay, so the good Z is going to be sold on the spot market. This is the rental housing market, and the cost is CN, N for non-committed. Z can also be purchased via commitments, and if you purchase via commitments, it's a cheaper price. CC is the cost that you pay per unit of housing, if you're thinking of housing as being this committed good, if you make the commitment. But if you do make the commitment, then the consumption has to be equal across the states of the world. That is, whether you're in the good state or bad state, you're going to be consuming the same amount of this good. The consumer who faces a positive risk of unemployment cannot make commitments in period T. This, again, is just an assumption. That is, we're assuming that if you're at risk of layoff, of being unemployed, then you can't make the commitment at all. Again, if you modify that sum, that's not going to change things except to make the arithmetic more difficult. Now, the timing of this is that consumption plans are set. Then people decide what they're going to do. The state of the world is realized. The worker is then going to be laid off with some probability rho of T. If the state is bad, consumption then occurs. Now, the risk aversion is endogenous. Let me just sort of try to give you a picture of what this thing is going to look like. On this axis is the good that I could commit on if I wanted. That's Z. On this axis is the other good that I can't commit on, X. Now, I'm going to have a linear homogeneous utility function. Linear homogeneous utility function so that this thing is just going out of the origin along any ray. This is linear. That's what I mean by the consumer being risk neutral. So that if in fact I was allowed to buy insurance about the state of the world, if I was planning on making no commitments, all that would do is either give me a low budget set or a high budget set. I'd be risk neutral. I wouldn't buy any insurance, or I'd have no strict gain from being able to buy actuarially fair insurance if I weren't planning on making any kinds of commitments about consumption. But now suppose that I want to make a consumption commitment because housing is cheaper if I commit ahead of time. Now I go out here and I fix Z at some level. The cross-section of this thing is strictly concave. That is, as soon as I make a commitment, now I've in fact got a concave utility function over X. If you now give me some variability in my wage, all of that's going to show up in X. What I want, if I didn't have to make a commitment, there's a fixed ratio that I want to consume these two goods in. If I make a commitment on this, then in fact what I'm getting is I'm getting a suboptimal ratio of the consumption of the committed good and the non-committed good. That's where the risk aversion is coming in. So assume that if there's a probability of layoff is rho in each of the periods, the consumer's problem is then going to be static. So the problem for an uncommitted consumer is going to be P is the probability that he's not going to be laid off. That's the utility of his consumption plan in that case. 1 minus P is the probability that there is a shock to the firm. 1 minus rho is the probability that the worker doesn't get laid off, so he's going to have an income. And that's his utility for his consumption plan in that state of the world, subject to the two budget constraints. In state 1, he has wage 1. That's his budget constraint in state 1. In state 2, that's his income. That's his budget constraint in state 2. So what you're going to get out of this thing is everything when you're not. I'm sorry. He has utility. I'm sorry. We normalize the utility function to be 0 in the case that.
What is X2?
Wait. When you're laid off, you have income 0. The firm can't pay you. So your utility will just normalize that to be 0. Okay. So what this is going to yield is a state-independent indirect utility function that's linear in the wage. That is, you solve this problem, and the consumer, since he's only going to wait until he gets his income realization to find out whether, in fact, he's got the high income state 1 or a lower income in state 2, perhaps, assuming he's going to be employed, he's going to be risk neutral. He has an indirect utility function over money that's linear. That's the point I made a second ago. He's not going to care about any risk in income. He wouldn't buy insurance. So his utility function is going to be linear, and we'll just assume that it's just U of W equals W. Now, when risk aversion is endogenous, it's a different problem for this consumer. That is, for the problem for a committed consumer, suppose the consumer now makes a commitment on housing. Then the problem that the consumer is going to be faced with is what? Well, first of all, we've assumed that he can't make, if he has any probability of being laid off, then he can't make commitments. So we're assuming here that he's not going to be laid off. All he's going to be facing is the variability in the wage that he faces if there's a shock to the firm. That's the probability there is no shock. That's the consumer's utility in the case that there is no shock to the firm. Then possibly different plan because there may be a different wage in state 2 if there is a shock. That's his expected utility. That's his budget set. This is going to yield state contingent indirect utility functions, which are going to be depending on the state, it's going to depend on the two wages. It's not going to be linear in income anymore. Now, in the paper, let me draw a picture because I think it's more informative than the arithmetic, since I don't have too much time. Let me just show you what the idea of this is. That is, there's a production function. There's a production function for the firm if there is no shock. And there's a production function for the firm if there is a shock. So let F and G be the production functions when there is no shock, when there is a shock. Now let's go back and let's just look to see what would be the what would be the way the firm would make its decisions about hiring? Suppose the firm just decided that what it wanted to do was to hire some number of workers. If it wanted to hire some number of workers, in general, what we might end up with are two different wages. If the firm was just going to pay the workers their marginal product, this is the production function, just the revenue product from hiring any number of workers. And if they were to hire the same number of workers for both states of the world and just do work sharing, that is, what we'll do is just change the wage of the workers when there's a shock to the firm, then they just have two different wages. Now, if they hire the same number of workers so that there's not going to be any layoffs, then the workers are completely immune to layoff risk. So what do they want to do? They want to make commitments. If they want to make commitments, now the fact that they're facing two different wages is costly. They're risk averse, given that there's going to be, they've made this commitment. If there is, then what the workers would like to do is they'd like to smooth their wages in that case. What they'd like to do is maybe the firm will, in fact, lower the wage a little bit in the good state and then raise the wage a little bit in the bad state. And if the firm did that, the workers would be strictly better off, and the firm could extract part of that. So the optimal contract for the firm would be to try to, in fact, smooth the wages some. But the assumption that we're going to make is that the firm can't pay above marginal product. That is, let me go ahead on this a little bit, and I'll come back to this picture in a minute. So, risk aversion is endogenous. The first proposition is that if we're, sorry? So that when risk aversion is endogenous, suppose that in fact suppose that the firm is, suppose that the workers are making commitments. If the workers have made commitments, then they will be risk averse. If the workers are risk averse, then you get what you expect. That is, if W1 and W2 are the wages in the contract that the worker has, if W is the average or the expected wage that he's going to get, then if I looked at this indirect utility function for the worker, this is the expected utility if the worker could smooth the wages, just get the expected wage. That's strictly higher, this is running out. Okay, I just ran out of red, I think, here. The utility for a worker is strictly higher if he could, in fact, smooth the wages. That's just the risk aversion. So the committed consumer is going to be risk averse and wants smoother wages. Now, suppose that the worker lives for several periods. So when a worker lives for several periods, this worker consumer is going to face some aggregate risk over his lifetime. Suppose the average risk over his lifetime is going to be rho bar. There's some kind of a contract that has some layoffs. Rho bar is the average probability of being laid off. Then the average probability of being laid off is just going to have to be the sum of the probabilities that each of the people at different ages of their life in the firm are going to be laid off times the number of workers. How would a consumer like to have that layoff risk distributed? Proposition is that the fairly obvious that what the worker wants to do is to concentrate all of that risk in as few periods as possible. Because if he concentrates it, there's these economies of scale in risk bearing. If he's bearing risk of being laid off, he can't make consumption commitments. Then he's risk neutral. So it doesn't matter. There's nothing bad about putting more and more risk in. Once the probability is positive, it's costly in terms of not being able to make these consumption commitments. Then you want to concentrate that into as many years as possible. From now on, I'll just call that the period when the worker is young. When the worker is young, he wants to concentrate, that is the period in which he's going to have layoffs. The proposition is that he's going to want zero for the early parts of his life, and then he's going to want job security after that. So the application of these employment contracts, we think of there being a continuum of infinitely live firms that produce X, this good from labor, and every period there's going to be a mass of 1 over n workers being born, and so we just have a stationary distribution of the workers. Each firm can be in either state 1 or state 2 with probabilities P and 1 minus P. For now, it's easiest to think of this as being a macro shock so that all firms are going to be in the bad state of the world at the same time. The output is just, in good state, is f of n bigger than g of n. And we're going to assume that the marginal products are higher in the good state of the world than the bad for any number of workers. So then the firms post their contracts. The contract is going to tell you what's the wage in state 1, what's the wage in state 2 if you're employed, and rho of t is then going to be the fraction of workers that are laid off in the bad state, and they're going to say how it's distributed. Who's going to get laid off if, in fact, there are layoffs that occur. So N2 is the number of workers that the firm hires that are kept on in any case. N1 is the extra workers that are hired in the case that there's going to, the extra number of workers that will be hired and kept on if it's a good state of the world. That's the workers that are going to have to be laid off if, in fact, there's a bad state of the world. So the probability, the proportion of workers that are laid off in the bad state is this number of extra workers over all of the workers that are going to be hired. Okay, so the assumptions, as I say, there's no payments to the unemployed, there's no wages above marginal product. The layoffs can either be random, that is, I just lay workers off randomly if there's a bad state, or they can be concentrated where the youngest workers are going to be laid off. All of the employed workers have to receive the same wage. Anybody that's facing any risk of layoff can't make commitments. And we're going to analyze the steady state. That is, the firms are going to use just a limit of means criterion, that is, they maximize profits per period. Again, if you had them maximizing discounted profits, it wouldn't change anything qualitatively. So this benchmark contract, if there are no commitments, then the workers are basically, if workers don't make any commitments, the workers are basically going to be risk neutral. They're going to be indifferent between concentrated and random layoffs. And the firms can choose anything. It won't make any difference. The firm solves the problem of maximizing its profits. That's the revenue in the case that there's the good state of the world. That's the total number of workers. That's the revenue in that case. That is the wage bill that they're paying in the good state of the world. That's the revenue in the good state of the world. That's the revenue, net revenue in the bad state of the world. That's expected profits. This is the participation constraint on the part of the workers. With probability P, they're going to get wage 1. With probability 1 minus P, they're going to get, assuming that they're still employed, they're going to get the wage 2. That's their expected utility. And that's the participation level, the individual rationality constraint. So that's the firm's problem. And the proposition, the optimal contract in this world is going to be one in which there's no layoffs and the wages are just equal to marginal product. So if workers don't make commitments, they're risk neutral. There's no reason for the firms to try to do any wage smoothing at all. And the optimal contract is one in which the firms are doing exactly this. They're just paying the marginal product to the workers in each of the 2 states of the world. Now, the point that I was making a second ago is that if you're in a world in which their workers are not making any commitments, that can't be an equilibrium. That can't be an equilibrium because if that were the case, all the workers, in fact, would then want to make commitments because they, in fact, have a secure income. So what's going to happen then is that the workers are going to want to make commitments. If the workers do make any commitments, then the firm is going to want to start smoothing the wages some. And if if the firm starts smoothing the wages, so if I look at this contract, suppose that what's the optimal contract when the workers make some commitments? Then if they make commitments, then at least at some ages, the layoff risk has to be 0. That's our assumption that you can't make commitments if there's a positive probability of being laid off. So the optimal contract with commitments must have some kinds of concentrated layoffs. Then the firm solves this problem where, again, it's just their expected profit, subject to the participation constraint, which is that the proportion of workers that are kept on in the bad state of the world, the proportion of workers that are hired, N2 is the number of workers that are working in state 2 only. N1 is the number of extra workers that are hired just for the good state of the world. So that's the participation constraint for the workers when there are when possibility of commitments. This is the constraint that we add that says that the firm can't provide perfect insurance. That is, our assumption is that there's some limit. I could have, if I'm a firm, I could have a negative shock. If I have a negative shock, then I might be able to borrow some money and provide some insurance to the workers. At some point, we get an Exxon kind of a story where you just can't borrow any more money. The firm can't provide perfect insurance. We put it in the constraint that the firm can't provide perfect insurance in a particularly simple way. We just assume that the firm can't pay above marginal profit. Again, there has to be some kind of a constraint, but how much of a constraint isn't, you're not going to change qualitatively the story that I'm telling. So the firm in this world can't provide the worker with perfect insurance without paying above marginal product in the state of the world. What can they do? What the firm could do is they could, in fact, let me pick a different color here. What the firm could do is they could raise the wage a little bit, and they could raise the wage a little bit by saying that what we're going to have is this number of workers is going to get laid off in the second state, in the bad state of the world. So the firm can, in fact, offer a worker this kind of a contract. He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to start smoothing your wage a little bit. If I smooth your wage a little bit, since you're risk averse, you're going to like that. The cost is I'm going to have to lay off some of the workers in the bad state of the world. Now, that's an envelope kind of a question. Which of these things is going to dominate? That is, the workers are going to be faced with a little bit more risk of being laid off, but if that's concentrated in the first period of their life, maybe that's not so costly. In return for that, they're going to get some wage smoothing, and that wage smoothing is going to, in fact, ameliorate the risk aversion that they're facing because they're making these consumption commitments. That's basically the trade-off. Let me skip over the next couple of slides, which are basically providing you with a set of sufficient conditions that guarantee you that the optimal labor, sufficient conditions under which the optimal labor contract does in fact feature layoffs. Okay, the kinds of things that are going to play a role there are going to be things like the elasticity of the labor supply, of the revenue product of the labor supply. If by making a small change in employment here, if the curvature changes a lot, then in fact I can give you a lot of wage smoothing for only a small unemployment. It's exactly just a comparison of the things that you would expect that are going to tell you what the sufficient conditions are that guarantee that layoffs will be optimal in some cases. They're not always optimal. For example, what's the gain? The gain in making consumption commitments is the difference between CM, what's the cost when you buy this on the spot market, and CC, the cost when you can make a commitment. If those are very, very close, you sit there and say it's not worth it. I can get almost the same amount of utility by not buying a house if I can lease a house for basically the same price. So what's going to matter are things like how different they are. If they're not very different, the optimal contract will have no layoffs. It'll just be everybody gets paid marginal product. Okay, what I want to spend the remaining 5 minutes I have, 10 minutes? 7 minutes, okay, good. Well, I'll settle for 7. That I want to talk about some evidence of the kind of contract that we're talking about. That there's a particular prediction that comes out of this kind of a model. And that is, suppose that I have this trade-off for the worker, trading off this idea that a little bit of layoff risk in return for some income smoothing. Suppose I have a firm or an industry, and suppose that in this firm, the probability that they get a negative shock is very, very small. If the probability is very small that they're going to get a shock, then I as a worker might be willing to say, well, if it's very small, then in fact, I don't mind having a lot of extra workers hired in state 1 because it's not very likely that I'm going to get a layoff. But if there's a lot of extra workers that are hired for the good state of the world, when there is a layoff, we're going to lay off lots of workers. That is, what we're going to get out of this model is going to be a negative correlation between the probability that you have a layoff and the proportion of workers that you lay off. So that if I have a firm, if there's a firm that has a very high probability of laying off workers, then workers are going to say that it's very likely that in fact we're going to have these layoffs. If it's very likely that we're going to have these layoffs, then in fact what I want is I don't want so many people laid off. So I believe, and the people in this room can tell me if I'm wrong, I'm not aware of other theories of unemployment that would have this particular property, a negative correlation between the steepness of this layoff profile, the layoff tenure profile, and the probability of the firm having layoffs. What we look at is the current population survey, and we look at the displaced workers and job tenure supplements from 96 to 2000. And we divide the workers into industry, occupation, geography, cells. Take 22 industries, 8 different occupations, and the years 1996, 98, and 2000. Out of all of those, there are about 1,000, a little over 1,000 of those cells that have more than 25 observations in them. Take those observations, and what we're going to do is we're going to estimate a relationship between the aggregate probability of layoff and the tenure probability of layoff slope. The prediction is that the more layoffs you have, the steeper that should be. That is, if I have very low probability of layoff, then when I do have layoffs, I should have to go fairly high up the tenure ladder before the people are secure from this. And this is the results of that, the probit. And what these this is the relationship between the probability that this top line is for industries that have a 15% aggregate probability of layoff. That is, they have any kinds of layoffs. And this is for 8%, this is for 1%. What the numbers are, these are statements that say that if you're in one of these high layoff industries and you have a tenure, that's the probability that you'll be laid off within the past year. This is the probability of a person with 10 years in an industry that has an 8% aggregate probability of layoff. And this gives us exactly the steepness. That is, if I look at these high, obviously, if you're in an industry that has a high probability of layoff, then you're going to have a higher probability of being laid off no matter what. But what this says is that if you're in this high industry, then what you have is that after about 7 years, you've cut your probability of being laid off in half. On the other hand, if you're in a low probability of layoff industry, you have to go on out to something like 12 years before you're cutting in half your probability of being laid off. So this particular exercise of looking at the steepness of this profile, that is, how long are you in tenured at this particular job before you're relatively safe from being laid off when there is a layoff. This is, I say, this is at least consistent with the particular model that I've outlined. And I'm not aware, as I say, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, that there's other models or theories that would predict that. Okay, let me just say a couple of things since I'm going to run out of time. A couple of quick things about this. One, that from that last picture that I just drew you, that is what I'm, suppose that there's heterogeneity in the firms in terms of the probability that they're going to have a layoff. What that's going to tell you is that the optimal contract that those industries are going to offer are going to be different. If all the workers are identical, the workers are going to end up with quite different contracts that they have, because what they're going to be facing are different probabilities, different probability distributions about when it's safe for them to in fact buy housing. So that the optimal contract here has sort of an extra degree of richness. So if I go back to your book on why the different workers that are similar, why do they get paid differently, this is telling you that in fact there's one thing that I think hasn't been explored very much, and that's that what's the probability distribution over the times at which they're relatively safe from being laid off. People have looked obviously at the probability of being unemployed. What we're saying is that in fact it gets to be a bit more complicated when you have in fact these consumption commitments. Also, since Bob is here, there's this old paper by Lucas and Rapping that talks about voluntary unemployment. This sort of adds a little bit of a wrinkle to that, and that's that workers in this model may in fact be unemployed. In one sense, it's completely voluntary. They sign the optimal contract. The optimal contract has unemployment. You'll be laid off with positive probability. But now notice here that this is not just a worker that decides it's better off working at home. The workers strictly prefer to be the ones that are kept on to being laid off. But it's still, so the question of whether something is voluntary unemployment or involuntary, it's a difference in whether you ask it ex ante or whether you ask it interim. If you ask them to sign the contract, they say, yes, I want to, in fact, take a contract that exposes me to being laid off. At the time I'm being laid off, I'm complaining and saying, I want to be the one that's kept on, not laid off. Last thing I'll say is that this is a model that was, the model here was generating this preference for contracts with layoffs by having consumption commitments. Our workers have a lifetime that's exactly smooth. There's nothing different about their consumption from one period to the next. If I go back to the literature on optimal consumption like Ignacio, I see that the consumption in general we believe is hump-shaped. That is, somewhere in your life, in the middle of your life, you have this time at which you want relatively high consumption. If there's a point at which you want relatively high consumption, relative to your income, you want to move income from later in your life to earlier in your life. In a world in which you want to move your income from later in life to earlier in life, you can do that at some cost. The cost of you doing that is going to depend on the security of your job later in life. This is going to give you another reason for why you might prefer layoffs. I'm willing to accept layoffs early in life because what that's going to do is it's going to give me a cheap cost of, in fact, moving income from later in life, earlier in life, a little bit later on. So that in a world in which there are some non-trivial life cycle effects on how you want to consume, you'll also get a preference for layoff contracts even without consumption commitments. So that you could have had a parallel paper here that was generated by life cycle concerns as opposed to what we do, which is generating it through these consumption commitments. I would have talked a little bit more about the empirical work, but I assume that's what Eddie is going to talk about. Yes. Okay.
Obviously, when I agreed to discuss this, can you hear me in back without this? Yeah, so I can. They want me to do. Okay, fine. So I also need help in switching technologies, though. Now, how do I switch to this thing? Unplug. Okay, before I start?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Turn it off? That'll destroy the rest of the, all the rest of the talks. Yeah, now it's fine. Okay, so the reason it's not seeing anything, I haven't put anything yet. Okay, so no, I won't be talking about the empirical work. Luckily, Andy spent some time on the model, so I have an excuse for why I'm focusing on the model and not the things that I know nothing about and couldn't comment on sensibly anyway. I can throw in one comment thanks to the fact that I presented the paper to a colleague and said, look, I agreed to talk about this. I saw two names that I know and didn't expect empirical work, and so a colleague has helped me, and I have one comment that I may get to. Andy said that this could be about something else, namely he talked about you could have written a different paper here. The main point that I want to make in this discussion is that this is already two papers. It's in fact two very separate papers, at least in terms of the modeling. It's a nice model, but it's really two distinct models, or a model that can be used, taken in two different directions. And the two directions are, one, this is a paper about commitment that leads to risk aversion, and the second is, this is a paper about commitment that leads to bunching over time. So it's a paper about how commitment affects risk preferences, and separately and orthogonally from that, how commitment affects preferences for consumption over time. So that's the main point I want to make overall, and hopefully it'll be convincing by the end. So what height does it get visible? Is that, yeah, that's visible. Okay. So here you'll see at the bottom, I haven't gotten there yet, but you'll see the picture that Andy drew so nicely with his arms. This is exactly what he was saying. So first let me go back and present the basic, very, very basic model. Consider Cobb-Douglas preferences. If you want, we can be specific and say that it's like square root x times z. Those preferences are going to be homogeneous degree 1. So and these are the preferences that Andy's looking at. So if we look at a ray going out from the origin, since it's homogeneous degree 1, then the utility function along that ray is linear. And this is the claim that there's no risk aversion along a ray. So if we look at constant prices and change income, then there's no risk aversion because we're going to be choosing at constant prices, say, prices that lead to that, and the same prices would lead to that, just at different income levels. You'll either choose this or this, and then you're not risk averse. On the other hand, if you look at a fixed level of the vertical line, which is here what I'll call the commitment good, if you look at a fixed level and look sideways, then you're holding one of these objects fixed, say x is fixed, and it's z that's the commitment good. So you're holding z fixed, and then your utility function is just the square root of x times a constant, so you are risk averse. So this is the basic first point of the paper as far as I understand it. If you have commitment goods, then you create risk aversion by the fact that you committed to z bar, and then you have risk aversion in x, and therefore risk aversion in over income. And if you look along, if you take a slice of the utility function this way, then you will have a nice concave utility function. Okay? So this leads to a nice conclusion. It's the first conclusion that I saw. If we consider a dynamic model with where you have a discount on a commitment good, then the attitudes towards risk cannot be deduced from choice of from observing. Sorry about that. From observing, not legible, but anyway. So the first point that the paper makes is the fact that you can't, by looking at how people choose income distributions, you can't deduce whether they're risk averse or risk loving. If they avoid income distributions, they might actually be, if they avoid risky income distributions, they might actually be risk averse. Risk neutral, sorry. So I think this is a very nice general point. I think it's related to another paper, namely the Krebs-Porteous paper, which makes the observation that, in general, if you look at a dynamic model with consumption choice, then preferences might not be, the induced preferences over income that you get from that might not be standard preferences. In fact, if the consumption choice, if there is saving, so if the model were expanded to allow for saving, and you make the consumption choice like housing, not initially. So it's not that before you're employed, you commit to buying housing when you're 42, but actually you make the choice during the path of consumption. Then when you make choices during path of consumption, you won't even have expected utility preferences, let alone that you could derive the risk aversion. So I think this is a very good point. It's related to one that's been made, but it's a very general and nice point. Okay. So the second, let's skip that. The second conclusion that this leads to is that consumers would prefer to bunch layoff risks. Now, the claim I will eventually make is that this is not because of that risk aversion. And I'll try to clarify that in a minute. So there are two aspects that I found confusing. First, calling this bunching of risk something about seeking risk. The bunching of probabilities in a time additive expected utility model has nothing to do with attitudes towards risk. Regardless of my attitudes towards risk, I could be risk averse, risk loving, risk neutral. And in time, if we do take the time additive model, then I don't care how to allocate probabilities. I could do it all in one period. I could split it up. It has nothing to do with whether I'm risk averse or risk loving. The reason in the model that I want to bunch my layoffs or my bad states together is because in bad states I can't have a commitment good. So it's not something that's one way to see that it doesn't have anything to do with the risk aversion. The second one, and here I have a bad line break, so I'm now looking at the second. It's not about risk aversion. I would say it's not about risk aversion because let's change the model. Instead of having the preferences that I drew before, which are the Cobb-Douglas preferences, so instead of this, where along rays we have risk neutrality, but along horizontal lines we have risk aversion, let's change it to a much more extreme risk neutral model, where preferences are just additive, u of xz is equal to x plus z. This isn't the model that's studied, they assume risk aversion. I claim that in this model as well, where you'll have risk neutrality when you go any line, this way or along rays, you still get the same result. Because the fact is, what you want to do is bunch together your risks at the beginning or your bad outcomes. You don't even have to call them risks. You want to bunch together bad outcomes. This is about how you want to distribute things over time and not about the risk aversion that's induced from making a commitment. It's an interesting issue that the commitment leads to risk aversion, but it's orthogonal to the bunching and to the layoff result. Okay? So, the next point I want to make is see. Just I want to be a little efficient on time. Okay, so the fact that given commitments people are more risk averse, I think, is an interesting feature. But the way to study the effect that that's going to have is not on this bunching of risk, but it's going to be on how different people invest, say, in the stock market. People who make commitments should be less inclined to invest. However, the problem with that is that people who, there's going to be a selection problem. I presume that if we looked at people who own houses versus who don't and their behavior in investments, that's going to be affected more by the tendency of the person to buy or not buy housing. The risk-averse person will just not buy housing and be willing to move around and fluctuate a lot. The less risk-averse, the risk-neutral person, will be willing to move around a lot. So I don't think that it's going to be very easy to figure out how to. I think it would be interesting. It's not my domain, the empirical side. I think it would be interesting to try to figure out ways to see whether commitment goods lead to risk aversion, whether that affects people. But the layoffs, I claim, is not the way, because that's you get that result even independent of that risk aversion. Okay. And the other thing I want to say is, so it's not about risk aversion, it's about risk neutrality. But if we take the risk neutral model, we can even go further. So one of the assumptions that Andy made was, in fact, that you can't pay more than the marginal wage. And the reason he made that is he wanted to avoid full insurance contracts. But since I'm getting rid of risk aversion, consider the model over here where people are totally risk neutral. There's not going to be a problem with paying more than the marginal wage. So now let's consider a model where there is just one state of the world, fixed wages, and ask what would people like in this environment. Well, if you think that the commitment good is a discrete one, such as, for example, children, not only are they not easily to rent, they're also very difficult to split in half. It's true that you can spend less on them, but still, there seems to be a minimal commitment involved. So there's a certain indivisibility involved in these types of commitment goods. So if we consider these indivisible commitment goods and think of just a constant income, but your income, that constant income, isn't enough for you, say, at age 30 to have a child. You really need more. So what a person like this would like is to undertake bad states at the beginning. So what we would observe in such a model is that the firm would pay low wages at the beginning and high wages later. There's no risk, no layoffs, no uncertainty involved here. Just the idea of an indivisible commitment good that you want to consume later, and therefore the firm would pay you very little at the beginning and higher wages at the end. So this is an example where without any uncertainty you get this bunching of bad things at the beginning and the good things later, but it has nothing, as I said, to do with the risk. Okay? I'm not going to even... So thank you to Yona, who gave me the one empirical comment I could make, but I think my time is probably running out, so I'll just conclude. I think the basic insight is on target. People are willing to receive lower income initially. And the lower income could be lower because it's random in the sense of the chance of a layoff, or deterministic because you just get paid very little at the beginning, because later in life they want to consume goods that require a long-term, reliable, high income. I think this is a very valid, right point. I can't imagine disagreeing with it. However, I think that it's not it doesn't only have to do with commitment goods. It has to do with the indivisibilities of these goods, that they're big and take a large piece of our income. And it has nothing to do with risk aversion, or at least less to do with risk aversion than what you might get from looking at the paper, because you could get it all by assuming a standard linear model, as far as I could tell. Okay.
Going up is got problems, and then if your income goes down, you might have to sell your house so you can buy other stuff. which is the risk you're talking about. It seems like you're both got to play a role here if you think about housing.
No. So I thought at the beginning I was trying to make clear that children are one thing, that's where it's really on the one side it's asymmetric. But for a lot of these kinds of things like houses, it's not just risk of going down, it's risk of, it's the cost of adjusting. Yeah. And if it's very costly to adjust, then in fact I'm going to end up with this random marginal rate of substitution between the two goods.
But to me, there's something attractive about having the commitment good be what commitment is model as incurring a cost to change the level of your consumption. Didn't seem like there's anything counterpart to that.
No. So the model the model doesn't deal with what you're talking about very well, but because despite the fact that I kept talking about things like housing over time, these were goods every period you're making a different choice. Right. So that if I had Fernando Alvarez to help me instead of you, I would have written the paper that you're talking about, that where you really have these goods being dynamic, where you buy the house and you adjust it over time.
In this case, neither you, me, or Fernando has to write it because the road may be written the road did.
Andy? Yeah, two questions that relate. One is, it's kind of a reduced, I don't quite get it. Just arithmetically, is there a mechanical relation between the slope of the tenure probability profile and the average level of layoff? Tenure probability of layoff profile and the average level of layoff, if they use a strict seniority rule. So take the extreme case where you got a really high layoff rate, everybody's going to be laid off, and the probability is 1 for everybody, so it's flat. And then if there's only one guy laid off in the firm, you just take the one guy at the bottom, and then everybody else has a probability of staying with certainty. And I was just trying to work through that and see if there was some kind of mechanical.
No, so that you need a richer model, because when we do the empirical work, we're assuming that in fact there's some variation in what the firm's probability of having to have layoffs are. In the model, there's just a probability.
Right.
If there's a firm that's facing just a probability of layoff, and either there's a shock or there's not a shock, then you're just going to have a step function. That is that when you do have a layoff, it's just going to be all the way up to this point for sure, and then after that, not. So all of the slope that you're getting there is coming from, to the extent that you believe the model is behind the data, it's coming from the fact that there's variation in what those probabilities of needing to have layoffs be. So now, you'd have to write down a model in which you wrote that, incorporated that variation in to be able to come up with an arithmetic expression.
Two comments. One, in some of these books, like children, they do have the issue that you want to have them early.
Yes. So again, I think discounting should in fact modify quantitatively the size of these effects.
You would not necessarily postpone.
No, what that means is that you're going to have an even stronger desire to in fact have the be able to make these some kinds of commitments, which means that you're going to want very concentrated layoffs. That is, you want the layoffs to be up by the time you're 26, you want them to be better.
Or eliminate.
Or eliminate. It's clear that in fact we have sufficient conditions that tell you when you'll have layoffs, but it may very well be that in fact the sufficient conditions aren't satisfied in the real world. In the real world, the optimal contract may in fact be this contract where there are no layoffs.
And another point is that many of these contracts that you observe within firm strongly depend on what are exactly the market alternatives that face workers in the absence of one of the institutions. Like you didn't mention unemployment insurance.
Right. Right. So to the extent that you can provide insurance,
should obviously affect what type of arrangement.
Yes. If you had insurance, if the insurance is full insurance, then you don't need to read this paper at all. That is to the extent that the workers are still going to be. Typically, unemployment insurance is for a relatively short period of time, so you still have substantial variability in the income, your lifetime expected income, despite the fact that you have that. So that'll ameliorate the effect. Let me just make one quick comment before we go on to the question.
Yeah, last comment.
Yeah, no, just I should comment on Eddie's comments. Yeah. Just that I thank you very much for those. I'd like to ask you if you'd send them to me. First, I'd like to say that I feel a little bit sandbagged on this. I thought with a paper like this, surely the discussant would be talking about empirical things. I could say, well, obviously that's not mine. I could blame somebody that's in the United States for any questions. But, sorry, I do thank you for the comments. I'll make one comment on that one point that you made. I forgot which point it was, that somebody has to on stock investments. There's a student of mine that's on the market that has gone back to use a model like this to try to understand the equity premium puzzle, which is related to the Grossman-Leroux paper, and the equity premium puzzle, and tried to say, okay, let's go back and try to see to what extent that can be explained partly by the fact that all the variability in consumption that you're looking at, which is too low in Prescott and Mira, suppose all of that variability has to be concentrated among one set of your consumption, that there's a part of your consumption that can't be adjusted. And then he looks to see what's the volatility. He looks at PSID, he looks at the volatility of the items that look like they're relatively easy to adjust, and says that in fact it's not so obvious that there's a big puzzle doing that, to make that comment.
Okay, we move to the here and way.
Of course, it's a challenge to be the last speaker of a conference. Although there is one thing. There is one thing I know about this. There is one thing I know is that Yoram will still be listening to me because his energy is without limits. I'm not sure it's the same for everyone, but this is joint work with Phil Rainey. So that's its theory paper. Its main motivation is empirical. The theory is about a matching model in which utility is not perfectly transferable. So we know basically everything about matching models in which either utility is not transferable or is fully transferable, what we call a transferable utility case. And this is a situation in which you can transfer utility between people, but not perfectly. But let me start with the empirical motivation. There's been a lot of work, and I've been personally interested a lot in this kind of work about resharing. So it could be resharing within groups. So like you study the way consumption is allocated within villages in response to shock to production, individual and aggregate production. So there is this seminal paper by Rob Townsend back in '94, and then there's been a huge literature. The same has been done within families, and the same has been done in a slightly different perspective in the linkage between risk aversion and intertemporal behavior. And there are some papers. So let me be a bit more specific about this. The main problem I see in this empirical literature, and this was really the motivation of this line of research, is how do we deal with heterogeneity? And what I will argue is that the empirical literature relies very strongly on one assumption, which is people have identical risk aversion. I will first try to convince you that it's completely crucial. So the way the models are written relies on this assumption, and if you don't make this assumption, the conclusions are qualitatively different. It's not simply a good approximation. It changes everything. In particular, it changes the nature of the tests which are considered by the profession as the crucial test for this. And then the motivation of the theory paper behind is there any kind of reason to assume that people have identical risk aversion? And the way we think of it is a matching perspective, namely, if you have a population in which people match and they are different, is there any reason to expect that they will match in some kind of assortative way, in the sense that despite the fact that people are different, the people who end up being matched are identical. So let me be a bit, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let me start briefly by reminding you this literature about efficient resharing within groups. Essentially, all the paper tests a very specific and very powerful prediction, namely the so-called neutrality principle up there, which is that individual consumption, under perfect resharing, individual consumption should only depend on aggregate shocks, not on idiosyncratic shocks. So if you control for aggregate consumption or aggregate production, whether the particular person at stake has been lucky or not should not matter. Now, that's fine. In principle, if you're a theorist, that's easy to do. You just control for everything that's relevant, and you look at individual consumption, you regress it on aggregate consumption and on individual income. And the theory predicts that the individual income shouldn't matter. And actually, this has been tested, it has been found to matter. Now, there is a problem with this, which is that if you write the first order condition, if you take this model seriously, what you receive should not depend on the realization of your shock, but definitely it should depend on your Pareto weights. I mean, if you assume efficient resharing, there is an implicit Pareto weight, and this will have an impact. But of course, assume that what we observe as an income is correlated with the Pareto weight. Not the realization of the income, but definitely the distribution of income might be correlated. And from an empirical point of view, especially if you have either a cross-section or a short panel, it might be very difficult to distinguish the realization from the characteristic of the distribution. So if someone has a high realization of income, it might be that this person has a high expected income, and this might have an impact on the Pareto weight. So the question is, how do we deal with this idea that income, the realization of income shouldn't matter, but Pareto weight and anything correlated with Pareto weight may matter, and how do we deal with this? Now, one thing it shows is that when you want to think about this kind of problem, you need a structural model. And in practice, that's the structural model that has been used. People assume constant relative risk aversion with identical risk aversion. So constant relative risk aversion is fine with me. That's a good assumption. Most of the time it fits the data pretty well. Identical risk aversion is more problematic. But it saves your life in this case, because what you get in this kind of setting is that the sharing rule is linear. So what the consumption of person I at day t is the aggregate consumption, which only depends on t, multiplied by this GI only depending on I, and all the effect of Pareto weights is into this GI. Now, because of this very nice structure, you take the log and you can differentiate out the Pareto weights, meaning that essentially all kind of tests you can do are valid, theoretically valid in the sense that you don't care about anything that might influence the Pareto weights because they are by using this kind of trick, either directly, which is done by a recent paper by Uri and Duflo, or indirectly by explicitly writing a structural model, which is what Rob Townsend was doing in his initial paper. But essentially, you can get rid of this problem. Now, the problem is if you do that and you don't have identical risk aversion, then you're in trouble because this relationship is not linear. And actually, it can be shown. We're working with Rob Townsend on Thai data on this, but it can be shown that simply the test doesn't work. Let me come to the other example, which is all this literature on Euler equation. Now, the basic idea of Euler equation is very simple, and it's the equation which is up there. Essentially, if you want to, the best prediction of the expected marginal utility of income next year or next period is the marginal utility of income now. And the way you test this, the standard test is, I try to explain the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, I put the current consumption or some kind of proxy for the marginal utility of current consumption, plus plenty of other variables that were known at day t. And the nature of those tests is those variables shouldn't matter. So in particular, if you try to explain the expected marginal utility of consumption next period, if you on the right-hand side you put consumption and then things like income, assets, whatever, all the right-hand side variables shouldn't matter. And this is the nature of the test that has been done repeatedly. Now, we got exactly the same problem, and everything I'm saying here is in a paper by Maurizio Mazzocco, which has been extended afterwards by Attanasio and Mazzocco. Assume that instead of an individual, you have a couple. And actually, the data on which this has been tested was data on couples. Well, then you have something like a weighted average. And there is a Pareto weight, as always. And there is no reason to assume that mu is independent on anything, on income, on weight, wealth, and so on and so forth. So in principle, if in this formula up there you put UH instead of this UI, you will have the mu. And if income shows up into the mu will show up in the right-hand side of the equation. So you might, by estimating this model, find a significant coefficient for income, wealth, whatever, not because the basic assumptions are violated, not because people are irrational or markets are inefficient or we don't have separability, but simply because what you're picking up with your Y or your wealth is the Pareto weight up there. Now, it's not always the case. And we have what was in the paper by Mazzocco is a complete characterization of those situations in which actually you can use this approach here, the Euler equation approach at the household level, because it turns out that the risk aggregates. And actually this was already, I mean, the intuition was already in an old paper by Bob Wilson in '68, the well-known silicate paper. The condition is the so-called Ishara property. So here the statement is the following. Hara means harmonic absolute risk aversion, so it is this form here for the absolute risk aversion. And the IS stands for identical shape. So if you look at the way this varies across people, the AI is allowed to vary across people, but not the B. So in particular, when AI equals 0, you got the constant relative risk aversion, and this boils down to the assumption that the coefficient is the same across people. Now, if this is satisfied, essentially you can aggregate risk, and you can use exactly the same tools for the household level as at the individual level. But if it's not the case, you don't expect it to work. And if it's not the case, actually you're in deep trouble, because you have plenty of counterintuitive effects that are documented in Mazzocco's paper. So in both cases, the existing literature relies very much on this assumption that people have identical risk aversion. So what can this assumption be justified? One possible justification, which is equivalent to some kind of prayer, could it be the case that agents are indeed Ishara in the sense that people have identical risk aversion? Not exactly identical, right? The AI might be different, but the key coefficient, which is the B coefficient, can we assume that this is equivalent, that is equal across people? Turns out that it's not the case. We don't have many empirical estimation of the distribution of risk aversion, but everything we have suggests that there is a huge heterogeneity, and there is no reason to believe that it's uniform. And this has been done in plenty of ways. There are all those papers with questionnaires in the Barsky and Al paper. People have been looking at portfolio composition. I have recently made an empirical study with Bernard Saranier in which we used the behavior in terms of demand for insurance, and everything suggests that there is a huge dispersion in risk aversion. So, and that was my starting point. Possible justification could be endogenous matching, in the sense that God did not create the world in such a way that all people are identical. But when we're looking at household, for instance, in this kind of Euler equation stuff, we're not looking at exogenously matched people. There is some endogeneity in the matching, and it might be the case that because of this endogeneity in the matching, the assumption is a good one, because despite some people are more risk-averse than others on both sides, it might be that the less risk-averse people are matched together and the more risk-averse people are matched together. So that's the motivation. Does it make any sense from the empirical point of view? And of course, this requires two things. One is that matching should be based on risk aversion. And this will make this assumption. Of course, if matching is based on something that are completely orthogonal to risk aversion, you don't expect that the miracle will be that people will be identical. So let's play the game. That's what theory should do. And let's assume that matching is based explicitly and uniquely on risk aversion. Now, that's what the theory can tell you is it the case that in this situation, the matching will be assortative? That's really what we're trying to do in this paper. So here is the model. There is a finite number of men and of women. They are ordered by risk aversion, which means the following: if you take two men, one of them is more risk averse than the other. And same for two women in the usual Auerbach sense. So we don't need anything like a functional form and so on. And then without loss of generality, we can rank them by increasing risk aversion. Each individual receives an IID random income, YI. Oh, sorry. And we're assuming that this YI is identical across people. Again, that's not because we believe that's the case in real life, but we want to concentrate on one only difference across people, which is risk aversion. Okay, yeah. No, this is a static model, right? We're not at all talking about the dynamics. This will be a completely static model. In the dynamic model, look, I can easily write a simpler model in which this would be addressed. For instance, if I just assume that people have constant relative risk aversion and they're a perfect financial market, then I don't have this problem, even in an intertemporal setting. But for the moment, this is a static model. Now, if two person ING are matched, they have a total income. They just pool their income and then they share it efficiently. Now, this means that marriage is always better. When two people have an opportunity of marrying, it's Pareto dominant to marry in this situation. Now, as you see, there are plenty of ingredients in this model that are Weissian in the sense that there is risk, there is income, and there is matching. One thing that's missing, which is even more Weissian, so that's one of the weaknesses of this model. One thing is risk aversion is the only trait. So we don't consider matching on anything else than risk aversion, and this is fine. This is the nature of the exercise. What's a bit more problematic is we assume that this income is completely exogenous. In particular, this income is completely unrelated to risk aversion. Now, that's problematic because one of the extensions of this model will be a situation in which if you're less risk averse, you make different kind of choices, in particular investment in human capital. And I mean, if I have time at the end, I will try to say a few words about how it mitigates the conclusion. But in this model, income is only completely exogenous.
What do you mean by shared efficiently?
Oh, it's Pareto efficient.
So you don't allow for renegotiation. They can decide on the rule of sharing ahead of time?
Of course, it's resharing. I mean, resharing is something like we decide on something, and then when the income is realized, we do whatever we decide. Oh, yeah, there will be transfers. I mean, it's really resharing, the usual sense that I'm lucky you're not, I'll give you some money. That's, the basic concept is the concept of stable matching, which is the standard definition. No married person would be better off as a single. And if I take two persons who are not married together, whether they're single or married with somebody else, they could not possibly be better off being married together. So that's not problematic. Now, in the literature, you can find two polar cases. One is completely non-transferable utility. So if Mr. I is matched with Mrs. J, the utility of I is this says I, the utility of J this says J, and there is no way to transfer utility between those guys. And in this case, so we have existence from Gale-Shapley. We don't have uniqueness in general. And the matching is assortative if and only if those guys are, a sufficient condition for assortativeness is monotonicity. So in other words, if the trait is income and if all women prefer wealthy men and all men prefer wealthy women, then in the end, all wealthy men are married with wealthy women. So we have assortative. The other case that has been studied in the literature on which we know everything is the situation in which utility is perfectly transferable. So what generated by a match is a total surplus, and it can be shared at constant price. So the cost in utile of giving one unit of utile to Mr. I is 1 unit of utile of Mrs. J, and this doesn't depend on who I and J are, right? It's because for a particular couple I and J you can always renormalize, but it must. Now here the basic result is that the stability is equivalent to the maximization of the total surplus, so the sum of the SIJs over all the realized match. So this gives you uniqueness, generic uniqueness, of course, and the assortative matching comes from supermodularity. So what matters is not that everyone prefers wealthy people, but is it the case that the marginal gain I get from marrying a woman with wealthier increases or decreases with my personal wealth? No, it's okay. This is one note. You will see that there will be a generalization of this actually in our paper. No, in this case, we're matching on risk aversion, so it's an intermediate case in which utility is transferable, but not perfectly transferable. It's transferable because we can share risk, and we're going to share risk in the Pareto efficient way, but of course there's a continuum of Pareto efficient allocation, so by choosing one instead of the other, in practice I'm transferring expected utility from one person to the other, but the condition will not in general look like this simple equation, UI plus Vj. So in particular, there's no such thing as a total surplus that I would maximize. Little is known. Existence. Existence is unproblematic. There is something like a folk theorem here that you can generalize Gale-Shapley to get existence, which is what we're going to do here. Uniqueness is not true in general. Turns out that in our case we got uniqueness. When is it assortative? There is a paper by Legault, a recent paper by Legault and Newman, and I'll also say a few words about this in the end. One thing is, when I was teaching this last year to my PhD students, and at the end of the course I mentioned this problem, and I made the bold statement that in this case you don't have transferable utility. And one of my students, who is a very bright guy, by the way, if he ends up on the market some of those years, Sam Schuller from Wall, came to me at the end and he told me, I hate to contradict you, but there are situations in which actually this is transferable utility. And there is a very nice result, which is if utilities are Ishara, actually this model is equivalent to a transferable utility model, which is a funny result. But in general, it's not, and I'm interested in the case in which it's not Ishara, precisely. So let me start with a 2x2 case. So essentially, what I have here I have two men, 1, 2. I have two women, 1, 2. So the nice thing is, I know that everyone will be married, so there are only two possible matching. This one, which is the assertive, or this one, which is the negative assertive. Now, and the assumption is that I normalize the notation in such a way that 2 is always more risk averse than 1. Now, the basic result is there exists a stable match. It is unique, and it's the negative assertive. By the way, if you think of it, the intuition is pretty simple. Let's take the extreme case in which those two guys are risk neutral. Then it's obvious, right? Because the matching in which 1 is matched with 1 and 2 is matched with 2 is not a very good match, because 1 gains absolutely nothing being matched with 1. I mean, if you're risk neutral, the gain of being matched with somebody who is neutral is exactly 0. I mean, and the gain of being matched with someone who is risk averse is of course positive. You can extract some rent from this person. So it's pretty clear that this matching will be. Now, what's very surprising is, intuitively, it sounds obvious. You try to prove it, it's a mess. It's extremely difficult to prove, and in particular, one case in which it's very easy is the case in which this guy here is risk neutral. That's unproblematic. In general, it's surprising, and it's much more. We started from this intuition. It turns out that this intuition is correct, but it was much more difficult to prove than we thought. So we just. Well, let me spare you the proof. In general, I say things like you can read the proof in the paper. Unfortunately, there is not yet a paper, but the slides are available and the proofs are on the slides. So I will be happy to send the slides to everyone who is interested. So anyway, okay. So the proof is not simple. The existence, I don't want to talk too much about the existence, but this is completely standard. You can generalize Gale-Shapley for the existence. So essentially, the basic result tells you uniqueness, and the unique stable match is the negative assertive one. So the next thing is n by n instead of 2. So that's the situation in which you have men here, 1, 2, and so on and so forth, and you have the same number of women. Now it makes your life much easier to change the notation and to put them in the opposite order here. So here I put at the top the less risk averse man and the most risk averse woman, just because. If you want, so the question is what kind of match do we get? Now we get existence. That's simple, and it's also easy to see that there is uniqueness, and the only stable match is the negative assertive one. Why? Well, just because. So the conjecture is, the stable match will have horizontal lines all around. Assume it's not the case. So at some point, let's assume here you have a deviation. So this guy here is not married with this woman, he's married with someone there. but this woman must be married with a man. Everybody is married here, who is here, and this 2 by 2, from the 2 by 2 case, this is a violation of stability. So if it cannot be stable 2 by 2, it cannot be stable in G. So it's pretty easy to show that, let me start. So it's pretty easy to show that there is only one stable match, and this is the negative associative match. Okay. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Now let me take the last case in which there are n males and n females, and let's say n is larger than n. So we have more on one side of the market, so some people will remain single. Now what's very easy to prove, which is here, is that again there exists a unique stable matching such that all men are married, and of course this means that n minus n female will remain single, and among married couples the matching is negative associative. That's fine. Next question, actually that could be the kind of the test that Eddie was alluding to. So there will be singles, right, in this model. There will be n minus n singles on this line. So here I stop here, right? So on this line, on this line here, I have to put singles. Where are they? Are they here? Where are the person who are gonna remain single? Are they up there? Are they down there? Are they somewhere in the middle? What's the intuition? Phil and I, when we started working on this, we both had the intuition it was completely obvious, right? And then we started talking, and then we realized that we both thought it was obvious, but what we had in mind was exactly the opposite kind of prediction. So for me, it was obvious that it would be up there, and for him, it was obvious that it would be down there. We realized that it was obvious, but completely opposite things were obvious.
Singles are the risk lovers or the risk?
That's the question.
That's the question. Are there the risk lovers?
I don't know what's up there and down there.
So this is by increasing risk aversion. So up there means risk averse, down there means risk neutral, less risk averse. Or they can be at the middle, right, for all what we know. So we started to prove something, and we couldn't prove anything. So then we decided to look a little bit, and we tried to look at an example. So the example is very simple. We take yi to be uniform on 0, 1. We take u and v to be constant absolute risk aversion with parameters sigma and mu. And we take a very simple situation in which there are 2 women, and let's say they're identical. You'll see why in a minute. And there are 3 men. So what we're doing is the following. Let's look at the maximum welfare that one woman can get by marrying any particular man, right? So let's assume that she marries a particular man and she gets all of the surplus. I'm not saying that this will be the outcome of the match, right? Actually, the outcome is indeterminate in this finite stuff. But let's look at this number here. And this gives you this expression here. So this is the utility of a woman with risk aversion mu when she's married with a man with risk aversion sigma and she gets all the surplus. Okay?
What is the negotiation happening? After they decided to match and then they negotiate on the function?
Now here is the...
Before they match, they decide on this, how to share the surplus.
I'm agnostic about this. I'm using a stability criterion. The stability criterion tells me the following. Is there a way for them to match and to share the expected utility in such a way that none of them can do better outside? So it's blocking, yes, exactly. It's some kind of core idea. So the core is not empty, but of course there is plenty of allocations in the core in this kind of situation. So the nice thing with computers is that this is not a very simple expression, but still it's very easy to plot, and this is the plot of this expression. Now, what's very nice with this is the shape up there. The shape up there is not monotonic. Now it might not be completely obvious, but this is a cross section. That corresponds to mu equal 5. And it's the way in which the utility varies with sigma. Now, this tells you that essentially the single could be anywhere. Well, here is the intuition. First, let's assume, oh, sorry, I don't have the right. Let's assume that all three men are in this part of the graph, here. Then the one who's left alone will be the more risk-averse one. Why? Because if you're here and the other two are there, essentially there is no way you can convince one of those two women. And they're equivalent. They both have mu almost equal to 5, so they both have the same graph. There is no way you can convince any of these women to marry you, because the best you can offer is this. You cannot offer more than this, because otherwise you would be better off being single. And of course, any of your two competitors can offer much more and still have a surplus with respect to being single. Of course, if I put my three men on the other side, oops, yes. Do I have it? Yes, if I put my three men here, it's exactly the opposite. The one who will remain single is the less risk-averse. And I could put one here, one there, and the third one in the middle, in which case the one who will be left aside will be the one in the middle. So essentially, what I have here is that there is no result. It could be anything. It depends on the characteristic of the model. Even if it is a very simple model in which by the way, this is Cara utility. So yeah, it's a fully transferable utility model. But still, I don't have a single conclusion. Now, whatever we're doing in a discrete situation, you can do that in a continuous situation. And just for the, let me go quickly through it, because what I like with this is that it shows you in which sense it's a generalization of the fully transferable, and how you can generalize this idea of the second cross derivative being positive. So now what you have is, so that's exactly this is the Pareto frontier, right? So if Mr. Sigma is matched with Mrs. Mu, the Pareto frontier gives you the utility he gets, U as a function of sigma mu and V. So this, for any particular sigma and mu, here I put U, here I put V, here I put U, and what's there is the equation of this curve, and of course, this is the H, and of course, this H depends on sigma and mu. It's a bit tricky, by the way, because we're going to do comparison across people, but this requires a cardinal representation of the expected utility. So the way we do that is we use the certainty equivalent. So what I call U here is the certainty equivalent of Mr. Sigma, and what I call V is the certainty equivalent of Mrs. Mu. So H is decreasing in sigma and mu, which simply means that it's always bad news to be matched with someone with more risk-averse. Now so we want to show that we want to derive conditions under which the matching, we know that there is a matching here, we want to derive conditions under which it will be negative assortative. Well, the way you do that is, let's assume it's the case. So now we know if it's negative assortative, we know which variable is whom, which are those two functions here. And then we write the stability condition. And the stability condition simply says that the utility that Mr. Sigma gets must be more than the maximum utility you would get with any Mrs. Mu, providing that he gives to Mrs. Mu at least the utility that she would get at equilibrium. So that's a straightforward generalization of the standard stuff. And you write the first order condition, and you have this very nice formula here, which essentially, I mean, that's not very surprising, but it gives you the imputation. So this gives you the distribution of the surplus. Now what happens is, well, when you have a finite number of people, you have some indeterminacy in the allocation of the surplus, because essentially the stability condition gives you bounds, but when you have a continuum, you can exactly derive, and essentially so you have a differential equation that you can solve. There will be an integration constant, and the integration constant is pinned down by the fact that on the one side, which is in excess, the last person will be indifferent with being single. Now, what's more interesting is, if you write the second order condition, and you get this condition which is up there. Now, remember that this is a sufficient condition for this to be a local maximum, so it's a sufficient condition for the matching to be negative assortative. You see in which sense it's a generalization of the perfect transferable utility. With perfect transferable utility, this capital H, the Pareto frontier, is some intercept which depends only on sigma and mu minus the utility V. In which case, the denominator here is -1, and what you get is that the second cross derivative is positive. Now, here you got this generalization, which tells you that essentially what matters is essentially there is a price effect. I mean, I don't have too much time to discuss this, but since you have a curvature here, there is a price effect, and there is the fact that there is a cost in transferring one unit of util to somebody. When you match with somebody else, this cost is affected. So there is the price effect, and which is exactly what this stuff is capturing there. So let me conclude. So there is the intuition, I think, is completely straightforward. In a sense, we go through very complex computation to get a very natural conclusion. Namely, if you want to maximize surplus, you need very risk-averse person to be matched with almost risk-neutral one, because that's efficient. Now, of course, what this statement here is completely incorrect, because there is no such thing as total surplus, but still, that's the nature of the intuition. If you want to know who's left aside, is much more complex, and we don't know nothing about this, except that many things can happen. Some extension. One is we have just heterosexual matching in this case. What about homosexual matching? What about many-to-one matching? So what about villages? Right? I'm talking about couples here. What about villages? And we don't know much. Actually, in this case, even existence can be a problem. We have a robust example in which we don't have existence. So. But could we get a result like perfect assortative matching cannot be stable? And this I think we could prove. That the matching, whatever, there might not be a stable match, but when there is one, it cannot possibly be perfectly assortative, which is what empirical work would empirically assume. Much more interesting, and again, that much more Weissian would be the fact that income choice might be endogenous, and if I am risk averse, I may choose a different kind of investment in human capital, and I may end up with an income that's less risky. And of course, it changes the conclusion, because here the story is, if I'm risk averse, I'm very glad to marry with someone who is risk neutral because he will provide me insurance. But of course, if the person with risk neutral has made some kind of very risky investments, so he has a very high expected income, but a lot of variation, this might change. I mean, I might be not so happy with the idea of matching with this person, because this person will be able to provide insurance, okay, but the risk is also much larger. So this in principle you would expect could mitigate, and when you take that to empirical data, it might be an empirical. But we Yeah, absolutely. So then you have to work completely the model in which the matching is only the second stage, and it has an impact on the investment you make. And there is all this literature on matching in which, in principle, it's inefficient. There is this old argument that you might make inefficient investment because part of it will be will benefit to your future wife, but the matching can restore efficiency because it gives you the exact incentive. So maybe we have something like this here, but I have no idea. I mean, we've not done that. But the conclusion still is that this assumption that people have identical risk aversion, which is prevalent in this literature, is very debatable. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, it seems that the right assumption should be exactly the opposite. Which means that we have to think from the empirical point of view of models in which this assumption can be dispensed of. Thanks.
The discussant has disappeared. Well, we never got back of him. So,
we plug in other papers by old friends. A paper by Kilstrom and Lafont, which has a continuum of agents, and they're all CRA people, and there's a distribution of risk-averse parameters. Another is risk neutral. And the technology is you got to have a firm with one boss and any number of employees, and it's a given that the boss has a risk in the return from a firm, and the boss has to absorb all the risk. So these guys organize themselves, and there's a cutoff level of risk aversion. Below it, you're a boss. Above it, you're a worker with a constant wage. And I don't know what the sexual interpretation is. I don't know who he is, but the most nearly risk neutral guys have the most employees. And
Yeah,
they didn't have anybody single because he had multiple mates.
Yeah, the setting, of course, is more general than this one, because what you have in mind, well, it's not a matching model technique exactly, and also you have many to one matching, but I mean, no, that's very relevant. Actually, I should mention this, and it's sort of strengthened this idea that when people gather, you don't gather with people who are like you. You tend to gather with people who are very different from you. And I think that's.
I mean, it's that I like very much the idea that from a very simple model like this, you get the negative and sort of matching. It's sort of the first thing I ask myself is, do I think that that's in fact what I observe in the world? I think maybe not. And I think that part of it is that in your model, all they do is share income. That if they also have to decide whether they should live down close to the river where it's pretty risky but high need, or they have to live somewhere else, as soon as there's a public decision that they have to make besides risk aversion, then you're going to get a sortative, some incentive for a sortative matching back.
That's exactly, I mean, I was alluding to that before the match, and of course it's also true after the match. If we have to make some decisions, then it's not completely clear that, of course. Now, this leads to a very, one aspect of this is the very interesting question, which is the following. Assume that you match two persons. What will be the risk aversion of the collective, of the group that you get when you match them, and how will it vary with the characteristic of the people? Now, in one case in which we can easily answer is the Ishara case, because then we have perfect aggregation. There is something like, in his paper, actually it was in his PhD dissertation, Mazzocco shows that this is the only case in which you can say something. In any other case, so any two utilities with not Ishara, you might have very surprising outcomes. For instance, you might always generate examples in which, when you match two persons and you increase the risk aversion of one of the match, the result is that you decrease the risk aversion of the group altogether. So if instead of matching with person A, I'm matching with person B with more risk averse than A, in the end, the couple that I'm making with B will be more likely to make risky decision than the couple I'm making with A. And the reason for that is that if I match with someone with more risk averse than previously, I will bear a larger fraction of the risk. So whenever I'm making decision, a larger weight of the weight in the decision process will be on my shoulders, and I am the risk neutral guy. So of course, it would cost me more in a sense, because whatever the risk, I will take a larger fraction of it. But it's so we might have any kind of very counterintuitive. But all this was in Mazzocco's paper. So.
By the way, this phenomena is very similar to what happened when you have state-dependent utility functions, and then you could define more risk-averse or less risk-averse even when you have state-dependent preferences, and then if your preferences in one state are much less risk-averse than the preferences of the other state, then you could find something like that. So it's not that surprising.
Okay, I'll have to think about that. Except when you have state-dependent, the respective probability. Part of the thing comes from the fact that I'll have to think about this. It has to do with the Pareto weights, which you don't have in this yet.
I'm not sure. Are there implications of this sort of, just in this last point, in fact the threat point is moving around from the point of view of divorce? And so have you thought about that? Sort of what's...
No, definitely. That will be, as you can guess, that's on the agenda. We've not worked out a model so far. But definitely, when you think of formation of this solution, one of the main reasons I'm interested in matching models to start with is precisely because when you talk about household, you want to be able to talk, and that was also what we did with Yoram. You want to think about the process by which they are matched, and this is not a random process. But of course, it's relevant not only on who's matching whom, is matched with whom, but also how is the surplus distributed for which the threat points might matter.
Well, usually, I have a question. When we talk about assorted mating, we talk about something observable. What is your story about observability of risk aversion?
There
I mean, we in the HRS, Barsky and all, is Barsky.
No, there is plenty of I mean, that it's an empirical question on which it turns out I've been working a lot, which is I mean, smoking. Well, although smoking, the matching of smoking is a little bit different. Now, assume that you have data, the panel data in which you observe people before they marry and after once they are married. You look at their portfolio composition before they are married.
No, I can see how you could infer as an econometrician, but I talk about real life.
Come on. If you
go back to your viewer here, Andre. If the household takes a hit in income, and we can look and see whose consumption, there's certain, this is looked at before, there's certain items that are kind of her items and stuff that's his items in the consumption bundle. So if she's insuring him, then when his income fluctuates a lot.
Yeah, but I thought
but
the question was, how do the agents know
Before
the other person's risk?
When you date.
Yeah, when
Yeah.
you date.
Why?
Yeah, but it's married here.
This is a problem under perfect information.
Okay,
Perfect
listen.
information.
Yes.
Dating is married.
We can continue disadvantage.
I just wanted to say that going one further, that it's observed by my stock portfolio, that I'll manipulate it in order to achieve a better agreement with my spouse.
Oh, no, it's a costly thing.
Right.
That's fine. But you know, if my take on this is if econometricians are able to observe it, the people involved should be able to observe it. I mean, usually we have the opposite problem, that people see things that econometricians can see. You don't know.
It's a risk.
Okay. There is a lunch now. One floor, the same place.
Oh wait, maybe it's the right moment. Once again, thanks to the organizer for this conference. I think I was very proud to be part of this conference. And, thanks a lot.